One of the main functions of the switch is to use the MAC address table. As a system plugs into the switch, by default, the switch is designed to know the MAC address on that port. The Layer 2 switch will maintain the MAC address table to use for forwarding decisions to each and every port that exists on that switch. So, effectively, as systems plug in and these addresses are determined, the switch is going to gain more information. Every time an individual system wants to communicate with another system on the switch, it must do so ultimately by the MAC address. This is how a Layer 2 switch is going to make decisions for forwarding data from port to port. In the MAC address table, there are 3 specific types of entries that can exist. The default type of entry is known as a dynamic entry. This is going to be the default setting on every switch port on Cisco switches. This indicates that the switch itself is going to enter information into the MAC address table based on what it has learned on that port. That's why it's called a dynamic entry. Therefore, when systems plug into dynamic ports, the MAC address table will know the destination MAC address through the process of sending and receiving frames from the system that is plugged in. These types of addresses in the MAC address table can be cleared out by the administrator. Additionally, when the system unplugs from the port, that MAC address will eventually time out or age out of that MAC address table. Now, we can also manually add MAC addresses to the MAC address table. Obviously, this is something that we need to configure, and before doing so, we'll have to know what the MAC addresses are. The manually added MAC addresses do allow us to assign or dedicate a port to a specific MAC address. In this case, it's a permanent or static entry, and it will never time out unless you, as the administrator, were to change it. Of course, in some cases, we may need to have security, and so there is one additional level of MAC address entry that can be added to a Layer 2 switch. This is what is known as a restricted static entry. This entry must also be configured very much in the same manner as a permanent entry, but the aim is that it does give us additional restrictions. What that means is that when we dedicate a MAC address to a particular port, only that MAC address would be able to use that port. If we set it properly, we can actually have an alarm fired every time a MAC address, other than what has been allowed, plugs into a specific port. Therefore, data must originate from a particular port for everything to be positive. If data violates our restriction policy, the port itself would shut down and become disabled. And this can then prevent anyone from using a switch as a launch point for a potential attack. Thus, we achieve a good level of security with restricted static ports. The only drawback to both permanent and restricted static entry is that we have to know what the target MAC addresses are. If somebody's network card were to go bad and we have to change the network card, this means that we're going to have to change the switch configuration as well, because there will be a new MAC address associated with that system.